As we move to take questions, could I just remind people if you could introduce yourself and say where you're from, and also if we could try and keep the questions short so we have more time to hear from Arthur. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. My name's Kathy and I'm from Transdev Australasia. So we're the largest provider of public transport across the region, and it's interesting because you started off by saying you touched on unions, and we're talking about an ageing workforce and transitioning to things like autonomous vehicles and electric buses and transport on demand, which my organisation is at the forefront of delivering. I'd be curious to understand how you see that transition happening if we're talking about workforces and unions and transitioning into that more flexible environment.
Well, thanks. With Paul Fletcher, who's the Minister for Urban Infrastructure, we're starting to look at how all these issues in that sort of motor space come together, and there are implications. Clearly, we've had a taste of that with Uber and what that's done to the taxi industry, but even people are now even talking about the demise of Uber in due course, because there's a question about whether people will individually own cars or whether cars will be pooled. I was talking to someone last night who said it could get to the stage where, through your credit card, you could customise what sort of car you're getting and what features you want on that car. So that could change from, trip to trip and all the rest of it. So we're getting to a pretty brave new world, which is leading to issues around how will that impact on road construction? Will it ease congestion? Will it increase congestion? Because if vehicles are being pooled, will that mean they're being used more than they are at the moment, where they might just be used for a journey to work and a journey home, etc. In terms of workforces, what's going on already, and I've noticed unions in New South Wales have picked up on this, and they're talking to, I think it was Airbnb and Uber, about the rights of people who are operators in this space, because they're not quite employees, they're a bit like contractors. And what does this mean about their rights and their working conditions in this new world? What does it mean, for example, if you're a contractor, you go to a bank to get a loan and they look at you and they say, well, your sort of income fluctuates a fair bit, it doesn't look all that stable. So, how do you deal with that issue of risk bearing in this sort of new environment? So these are all the sorts of questions which I think are going to be around, and I think it's better for us to start thinking about it rather than wake up one day and find we're being asked to do this or that as a policy prescription without having a framework around what we're doing.
We'll just get you the mic.
I'll get you a microphone.
Hi, I'm Karen Cooman from IBM. And just in relation to workforce of the future, I just wondered if you're familiar with the concept of that's emerging in terms of the language of new-collar jobs. We've got white-collar jobs, we're all familiar with, and blue-collar jobs, which we also know about. But in this whole new digital economy, we've been sort of arguing for a recognition of the new-collar jobs, which are a mixture of both. And many of the new industries we're finding at IBM, certainly, we don't necessarily need people with a computer science degree, but we need people with some strong STEM skills or some strong professional qualifications, but sort of what the old apprenticeship regime might have been. And they're the people that we are facing huge skill shortages for in relation to cybersecurity, in relation to database management, in relation to some of the AI management. And so I think there's this middle ground which I think industry has a huge amount to contribute to in terms of the scope and the opportunities. I think we need to work with the schools and the universities, but also the TAFEs, because feeding into your comment about lifelong learning, these skills will need to be updated continuously. And then there's the other component of getting younger people, or all people, whether they're old or young in fact, to be workplace ready, to be able to work in a flexible environment and know what's expected of them. And particularly young people find that challenge. How do you work in a global team when you never see your manager, for instance? So I just wanted to share that and see whether that was part of the agenda.
I've heard of the new collar jobs, and the question it raises in my mind, and you alluded to this in your question, is how do you get the education and training system to be responsive to what is actually needed? This is quite a big issue. you'll all be familiar with the imbroglio recently over vet fee help and the impact that had on the private training colleges. And that led to a bit of a backlash, which also then led to people trying to cement the role of TAFEs. But my concern about TAFEs is they've always been the poor cousins of the system in one way or another. And it's how do you get them to be more competitive, to be worth more investment in, because they're worth investing in, but states, Labor or Liberal, have not tended to invest in them. There was a view they should be more exposed to market forces. Whether that was done in the right way, I'm not sure, and that's where the whole vet fee help thing fell over. But the point is, how does also industry, I think, get more of a voice in helping to shape the priorities of the education and training system? In a funny way, it's an analogue to the collaboration issue we were talking about before in the context of industry policy and innovation. We actually also want industry collaboration on how the education and training system functions. And I'm aware that when Tony Abbott went to New York a few years ago, he went to a P-Tech, which I think IBM were part of, and we stole that concept, and we're rolling out a series of P-Techs across the country here. I don't know whether IBM are involved at the moment, yeah. And the point of that was to get kids in the last few years of school and essentially give them a bit of a taste of workplace learning as well while they're finishing off their high school, and sort of, in a sense, trying to create more of a pathway from high school into work in a sort of fairly rigorous and innovative sort of environment. Now, you can't do that all over the place, but really we've got to think about that sort of innovation in the education system. And that's a big challenge at a time when you look at the debates we have about education, whether it's higher education or schools, they've tended to be bogged down a lot of the time, at least in recent times, around basic funding issues, which in a sense are important, obviously, but the curriculum, that linkage we're talking about is also very important, and I think there's more work to be done on those fronts.
Thank you, Minister. Duncan Anderson, I'm a Managing Director of a regional TAFE in Western Australia.
Uh-oh.
No.
I'm about to get it now.
I'm also fortunate to sit on TAFE Directors Australia, which is a peak body representing all TAFEs. Yep. One of the challenges we face is getting a combined or united voice from industry to actually tell us what to do. I agree with your comments that TAFE is a poor cousin, but what can the government do to provide united direction to TAFEs to be able to respond to what industry needs? Because it's very clear, but unless we know what industry wants, we can't do it.
See, I think one of the dilemmas is it comes back to this thing called federation. You've got this Commonwealth-state divide, and it also impacts on who administers what in this sort of sector. And I remember in the early 90s, there was a lot of work done through the Special Premiers Conferences to set up groups like ANTA, National Training Authority, which was you'd remember. Yeah, which we abolished in government, that's right. Thanks for reminding me. Yeah, we move on. Everything old is new again, don't worry. But my point is, ANTA was set up to try and overcome this. Now, over time, of course, there were centrifugal forces in the system because no one really wants to give up everything, particularly sovereign governments, state or federal. So it never quite got the traction. But the important thing is working with the states now that we're able to put what we're doing in a broader framework, I'm hoping we can have a direct conversation with TAFE. I think the Commonwealth needs to also not deal directly with TAFE. We've got to respect the fact that they're owned by states and all the rest of it, but I think they've got to be more encouraged to come to the table as a player in their own right. So that's a work in progress, but it's a good point.
Minister, thank you for an interesting address. I'm Keith Besgrove. I'm from Energy Consumers Australia. You said in passing that you were looking to develop a more full-throated digitisation strategy. Can you give us an idea of what more full-throated might look like?
Well, for example, when I was taking the country of origin labelling legislation through the Senate, one of my Senate colleagues, one of the crossbenchers, said, look, we'd really like SMEs to give us a lot more information about their ingredients and their products, more than we could really put on the labels that you see in the supermarkets, right? But the problem with that was, for a lot of these SMEs, they weren't set up to be able to do that. And it was something where it would require quite an effort for them to do this properly. And it just got us thinking that, sure, we try and do digitisation in the public sector. We've got a whole digital transformation agency. We've got Data 61 who are doing fantastic work. With all these things we're doing in the public sector to be an exemplar in this regard, but it was really saying, well, okay, where are the gaps in the private sector here, particularly at the SME level, and what do we do? And this is a work in progress, so I've commissioned people to look at this. What's the best way to help those companies to be more online in the right way that is also a competitive advantage going forward? We're also looking at the way some of these big international players operate. You look at an Alibaba. Look at how many people sell their wares on Alibaba, how many SMEs. Alibaba has made a virtue of the fact they've got these millions of SMEs on there. You go and talk to Jack Ma, the owner, and he says, I'm in the business of making all these SMEs do really well. Now, what we're about is, first of all, SMEs in their interaction with government, make it as seamless as possible with business registration, business licensing, whole series of things we're doing with the states. So you come into a portal, a government portal, you only deal with people at one level. You don't have to be continually entering and re-entering information. That's part of business dealing with government. But then, as a competitive advantage, how do we help digitisation help those SMEs?
Okay, thank you. I think we've got time for one last question.
It's always the last one that kills you.
Well, I have one lined up if there's no one in the audience.
Thanks. What department are you coming back to?
Is someone in the audience going to save me, or will I have to ask? All right. Well, you mentioned Josh Frydenberg and energy.
Yes.
And I think he was at his most energetic when he was looking after the red tape agenda.
Yeah.
And I think you talk about competition and tax policies, and you were just starting to touch on it, but how are we going in terms of deregulation, which is so important to industry?
I think at the federal level, there's quite a burst of activity the first couple of years we were in. Then there was a view that it's not just about the paperwork, the compliance burden, it's also more about measures that, sort of stop you from being as productive as you can be, regulations that stop productivity, that stop competition and the like. And so there's been more of a focus, and the Treasurer announced this in the budget, around how do we deal with, for example, multiple layers of government and the red tape impact that they have on a business. So if you're a business, you don't just worry about the fact that you've got red tape coming from here or there, you worry about the cumulative impact on you. And it's about us working with the states. We set up a $300 million fund in the budget to talk with the states about red tape reduction, areas like land use and planning, which also play into a broader agenda around cities policy. One of the things that's quite close to the PM's heart is these city deals, which we're doing in various parts of the country. The one in Western Sydney, which is going to be linked to the airport, is going to be quite a big city deal, and we use our infrastructure funding to encourage the state and local governments that are relevant to this to cut red tape, improve their land use and planning laws and all the rest of it, so we get proper development occurring in a timely fashion. But there's more to do on that front. Maybe you can do some of that when you get back.
Will you all join me in thanking Senator Sinodinos?